Hey there, it's Silver. This is Astrea, Six-Sided Oracles. So this is a dice builder, it's calling itself. So basically it's a turn-based RPG that uses deck building mechanics, but instead of applying them to cards, it applies them to a hand of dice. So this game has a lot of really unique mechanics to it, but the first thing I want to talk about is its presentation, because it's beautiful. It's a really pretty game. It's got this very sort of astral theme. Everything is all hand-drawn and all very beautiful, and there's a ton of detail in terms of all of the characters and enemies, and even the dice themselves have a lot of really pretty sort of minimalist dice face art and stuff like that. It's all really nice stuff, and you've of course also got lots of like constellations and like moon and stars themes for a lot of things. It's all really nice looking. I mean, even the interface gets in on the action, because the draw pool is actually different looking for each different character you can play, which is cool, and also the discard pool is like a black hole that all your dice go into. But the real star here is the corruption and purification mechanic. So this game doesn't have a traditional health gauge or anything like that. Instead, you have these purification bars for yourself and your sentinels, which are little allies you can get. You can recruit them from sentinel shops, and there's also a character that starts with them because a lot of their mechanics revolve around using them in different ways. However, enemies have a corruption meter instead, so purification is blue and corruption is red. Now, it's normal in dice builders to, you see the intent of what the enemy is going to do. Things like Slay the Spire help to pioneer that concept, and you're supposed to react so that you take as little damage as possible, ideally none, by shielding yourself and stuff in advance. And in this game, damage is not only unavoidable, you will take damage no matter what, it's also sometimes a good thing because of the way the health mechanics work. So if you purify an enemy, it hurts them. It depletes their corruption gauge. If you purify yourself, it heals you. It will fill your purification gauge back up. And it goes the opposite as well. If you corrupt yourself, then it hurts you, and if you corrupt an enemy, it heals them. And all of your dice have, of course, 6 different faces, and they can be all sorts of different things. There are a tremendous number of dice in this game. I think there's like over 300 different ones, so there's a lot to find. And there are neutral dice, and there are character-specific dice. So this is pretty common in deck builders, where you have a sort of neutral deck of stuff that everyone can pull from, and you have things that are specific to that character that help with their playstyle. And this game does use that. Now, you can end your turn at any time. You don't have to use all of the dice in your hand if you don't want to. However, if you roll any corrupted dice, you have to use them before ending your turn. So you might think, well, if I roll like a really high corrupted dice and I don't want to hurt myself with it, I can use it on an enemy that's already at full health. Maybe I'm targeting one specifically and the other one is still at full health. That way I can't really heal them because they're already full. Well, the devs thought of that, and there's also a mechanic called overcorruption. Every enemy has an overcorruption gauge below their health, and this fills up whenever you use any sort of corruption on them, or if they corrupt themselves. And once it fills up, it empties back down, but it triggers an overcorruption effect that is displayed below their health gauge, so you know every enemy has a specific thing that they do. So you can't necessarily corrupt enemies freely, because you will be effectively giving them a free turn once you fill this gauge up. So you got to be careful about where you're placing your corruption. But the other cool mechanic with this are the virtues. You'll notice that your blue health gauge has some circular symbols above it at different lengths, and these are your virtues. You have 4 of them, 1 at the tip of the gauge and then 3 at various points along it. These are activatable skills that are unique to each character. And the one at the end of the gauge, this is something that you can always do once every turn. So no matter what, you will have this active skill that you can use. And since every character has their own, this is usually a very like play-style focused skill, something that enables them to do whatever it is that they do, but better. And the other 3 virtues, however, the ones that are placed along the health gauge, these are only usable if the health gauge gets depleted to that point. So this is one of the reasons that you'll actually want to take damage on purpose, because the more damage you take, the more of your virtues you'll be able to use. And the really cool thing about them is these are not limited to once per turn. These can be used multiple times per turn. So if you hurt yourself, use one, heal yourself back up above it, hurt yourself again back down, you can use it again. And you can keep doing this multiple times per turn and get several refreshes of all of your virtues and use them repeatedly. And this is not an exploit, by the way. This is an intended game mechanic. You're actually supposed to do this. So rather than the normal deck builder fare of battles being about avoiding as much damage as possible and killing enemies as fast as possible so they don't have a chance to steamroll and get too much damage on you, In this game, it's all about managing damage versus healing for both you and the enemy, and you'll find that just about everything in your arsenal has multiple uses depending on who you use it on. Like, for instance, you may have some dice that add light shield. Light shield will prevent a point of corruption per point of shield, so you can shield yourself, and this way, if an enemy is about to hit you for something, you can, mitigate the damage. But you can also use it to get rid of a corruption dice that you need to use on yourself to end your turn. You might shield yourself first and then use it so it doesn't hurt you as much. Or you could actually shield an enemy so that if they corrupt themselves, they don't get the heal from it. And it also won't fill their overcorruption gauge because it wasn't applied to them, the shield blocked it. So yeah, pretty much everything has multiple uses, and I think this game really enables a lot of very clever plays because of that, but this also means the game is very difficult, in my opinion, because it expects you to understand these clever plays and be able to use them to get yourself out of difficult situations. So the game is definitely on the harder side. I haven't actually managed to beat the third area boss yet. I've made it pretty close, but I haven't quite managed to do it just yet. So this is definitely the kind of game that demands a lot of mechanical knowledge from you. It expects you to get used to how all these mechanics work so that you can learn how to manipulate them to your advantage in as many ways as possible. This is a game that rewards clever play above all else. After each battle, you'll be given a choice of 3 different dice, and one will be safe, one will be balanced, and one will be risky. And you'll be given 2 of these choices of 3 that you can choose one of from each. So basically, you can get 2 different dice after each battle. You can also choose to skip one if you want to, in order to just get some extra shards, the currency that you use in shops and things. And this is, of course, par for the course with any sort of deck builder. You don't always want to keep adding new things to your deck, because you may just be diluting its potential instead of adding more flexibility or something. You got to be careful about what you're building, and this is, in my opinion, even more true in this game than in a traditional deck builder, because if you're dealing with cards, whatever a card does, it always does that one thing. A card only has one face, generally speaking, but a dice has 6, or a die has 6 faces in this case. So this means that you've got to be careful about diluting your pool of dice too much, but also you want to have enough to deal with multiple situations. And safe dice will be dice that have pretty much entirely positive effects. They won't be very powerful positive effects, but they will be all positive. Balanced are in between, right? They have some negative effects and some positive faces, and usually they're more powerful for both. And then risky, these have a lot of negative aspects to them, but the positive ones they have are extremely powerful. In addition to this, there's also a 4th kind, epic. Epic dice are only gained from final boss battles of a chapter or from epic dice shops that you can very rarely come across, but they're very expensive. They're like 300 shards per dice, so it takes a while to actually build up enough to get to them. But these are really powerful. They have a cool little border around them to show them that they're epic dice, and basically how these work is that they are like safe dice in that they're pretty much all positive, but they have the power of the positives from risky dice. So they're super strong, but they also don't really have a downside. You may notice, by the way, that risk-reward is an extremely important part of this game, and yeah, it's definitely a key facet of how everything works. Pretty much everything is risk-reward. Do you risk getting some risky dice, knowing how powerful they are, but maybe you do or do not have the ability to deal with the negative rolls when they come along? Do you risk letting your purification gauge get low so that you have less health left, but it allows you to use some of your more powerful virtues in response? And another aspect of this are the blessings. So a lot of deck builders have items, passive items, that you can gather that give you various effects. And this game has those, but they're called blessings, and there are 2 different kinds of them. There are star blessings, which are entirely positive. They are usually of like medium strength, so these are your useful passive items that don't have tremendously powerful effects, but are still really nice and add something to your build, so you want to collect these when you can. And then you have black hole blessings, and black hole blessings are of course much more powerful, but they all have a downside of some kind as well. And really, but it has a downside is basically the motto of this game. Everything about it is all risk-reward. It's all about managing your upsides and downsides and coming out, hopefully, a victor by a lot of clever play. You may be choosing some really risky dice that have a lot of really negative effects that are quite potent, but at the same time you may have a bunch of rerolls that are really reliable so that you'll know you'll be able to re-roll them. You may have a bunch of discarding dice that allow you to discard stuff you don't want to play so that you can avoid having like big corruption totals you don't want to use. Or you may even have a bunch of like doom and corruption stuff that's really strong, but you have a bunch of really reliable conversion dice that allow you to change a corruption into a purification purification of equal value. So you may roll like an 8 corruption dice, which would normally be pretty crippling to you, but you can suddenly turn it into an 8 purification and deal tons of damage to the enemy. So it's all about the build that you create and how it manages the risk-reward mechanics of this whole dual health system. Another thing to note, by the way, is that the characters are all vastly different from each other. They all play completely differently, and this game does something that I really like, by the way. It makes every character have a lot of stuff that's unique to them, not just the dice. So, you know, I mentioned that there's a neutral pool that everyone can pull from when you get new dice, but there's also a character-specific pool that's unique to each character. However, that's not the only thing that has a character-specific pool, because even the blessings, the star blessings and the black hole blessings, these also have character-specific and neutral pools. So this is unusual for a deck builder. You know, usually in a deck builder, the passive items you get are the same across the board for everyone. You know, everyone has access to the same ones. So the fact that this game decided to make some of them unique to each character means that there's a lot of viable builds because of these sort of accentuating blessings that are character specific, allowing you to come up with very potent builds based around really specific mechanics if you have the dice for it. Another really important aspect of the game is the mitigation of RNG, because if you're making a game about dice, that's inherently going to be very random, right? Because you can't really control how a dice rolls, you just roll it, and whatever it comes up with is pretty much entirely random. So they needed good ways to mitigate RNG to make it feel like you had no control over the battle, because if everything was just as random as possible, then, you know, it would feel like a win or a loss was basically all luck and no skill, and that's not really satisfying for the genre. So a lot of the mechanics they've put in are to help with that. They mitigate the RNG, they make everything feel less random, and they make it feel like you have multiple ways to deal with the stuff that is random, so even if you get an unfavorable roll, you still have some way around it or something clever you can do with it that makes it feel less like, oh, I had a bad roll, therefore I lose, and there's nothing I could do about it. So when you combine all of these dice faces and all of the virtues and all the items and stuff, you get a game that has a ton of variety to it, like a huge amount of variety with all the different stuff that you can find, but also manages to use this variety as a sort of vector to limit how much random is in the game, how much randomness it feels like it has. And that's a difficult thing to do, you know, if you're making a game surrounding dice rolls, literally, then you've got to be really careful about making sure it doesn't feel so hands-off that the player has no input in what's happening. So that's the kind of thing that I think the devs really deserve a lot of praise for, making something entirely about dice rolls that doesn't feel frustratingly random. Another thing to note, by the way, is involved in all this variety, there are tons of status effects in this game, like huge amounts of status effects. A lot of dice are based entirely around building or transferring status effects of various kinds. So this is the sort of game where you can't ignore status effects. You know, if you've got one or if an enemy has one, you have to pay attention to it because there's a ton of them and they're usually very potent and often change how you want to play around them. So overall, I feel that this game is a really solid step forward for the concept of a deck builder, but done very differently with dice instead of cards, and it does a fantastic job at creating this really rewarding yet risky gameplay that has so much cleverness built into it that it makes you feel really smart when you defeat a particularly tough boss or a really hard elite encounter or something. You feel good about your victories, basically, because they take a lot of effort in this game, but with the massive amount of variety and stuff it has, it makes it a really interesting experience, and I'm definitely a big fan of it, so I would highly recommend this game. That is my verdict. I would say I've had a lot of fun with it so far, and I'm going to continue to have fun with it as one of those games that I play a run or two of when I'm winding down and stuff to just have some satisfying gameplay that makes me think a little bit, and of course all of the really nice presentation, very smooth interface, and all the interactions and dice rolling and things is all just really well presented and nice looking. It helps to combine with all of that to make it a really good experience, I think. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Astrea if you wish to check it out yourself. Highly recommended. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.